The film Stolen Education is a documentary about the racism, segregation, and discrimination that Mexican American children had to face in a Texas school district called Driscoll ISD. During the 1950s, Driscoll Elementary School would make their Mexican American children repeat the first grade for 3 years while punishing them for speaking Spanish in school. As a result, 8 students, along with their families, created a court case against Driscoll for discriminating against Mexican American students. Enrique Alamán Jr., who is the son of one of the students who testified, Lupe Alamán, decided to find the other 7 children, witnesses, and board of trustee members after his mother passed away to find the untold truth of what happened in Driscoll. As he creates this documentary, we are shown how racism has damaged the students of Driscoll and how the Board of Trustees did this to segregate and discourage their Anglo and Hispanic students. Driscoll Elementary School used race and language as an ethnic marker to exclude Mexican American students from getting an equal education. Instead of Driscoll tracking students by their academic ability, they used race to separate their students and use their language as a cover-up for the racism being done. Ferguson talks about racial and ethnic concepts being used to control, define, and exclude others. Ferguson states, regarding the racial and ethnic hierarchy, young children understand that in U.S. society, higher status is awarded to white people. In the film, it was obvious that the Mexican American students knew since they were children that they were inferior to white people and that they didn't have the equal opportunity to succeed.
So the theme of social class is seen in this documentary, mostly in the first half, and it really is just talking about how these kids were not only discriminated for being Mexican American, but also because of their economic situation at home and their community in general, because their schools, the Mexican schools, tended to be more with less resources, not the best teachers. And there was a professor that actually they interviewed. His name is Ignacio Garcia, and he talked about how they would take money from the Mexican schools to give to the Anglo schools. So the big people in charge would abuse of that, of their power, and they would take their money, and then when they would ask, like, where's their money? Like, where are our resources? Like, why don't we have books? They'd be like, oh, there's just no money for you. That was their excuse, even though they knew where all the money was. But what they believed, I quote, they say, why should we take the time and spend the resources to upgrade this community? Just kind of saying, like, it's a waste. Like, why they're Mexican Americans, they're behind. Like, why would we spend our money on that? And it's the dumbest thing, because why are we seeing these kids because of their economic situation and not by how smart they are, their education, what do they know, their knowledge. So the third theme is gender. I don't feel like we really saw this throughout the documentary, just like a little bit, but most of the interviews, they all had the same experience, men or women. They were physically and verbally abused as a child, and obviously that took a toll on them now that they're older, as we see now, like we saw in the documentary where they are today. Unfortunately, most of them did not make it to college, or they just grew up thinking like, no, like I can't speak Spanish. I can't, I'm not smart. I'm just thinking what they thought of them. And they were like, we're never talking about this. Like, we need to, our kids, they can't suffer the way we did. A lot of them had that mentality that we're not teaching your kids Spanish because we don't want them to go what we went through. But what I did notice, like gender-wise, was that most of these decisions, these cruel decisions, were being made by men, specifically white men. We did see some female teachers being mentioned, but in reality, all of the decisions that were being made were made by men to keep these kids behind and not show them how big they can be.
South Texas Driscoll performed what is called subtractive schooling, which is a dual strategy of exclusion and condemnation, divesting Latino students of their primary resources, their language and culture. This strips one of their identity and nationality, later affecting the generation of that family to come. For example, my grandma was hit in school for speaking Spanish. Therefore, her children were only taught English, leading up to the third generation to know no Spanish whatsoever. This was my generation. Learning English at all costs is the way to guarantee success in life. This is the ideology that some Mexican American families carried throughout generations due to subtractive schooling. Ferguson stated, "It results in disdain for what one knows and what one is, influences children's attitudes towards knowledge, and undermines their personal competence. Denying one's access to education due to their nationality is flat out racist. Such discriminatory actions lead the children to have no faith in the educational system and deprives them of the want to learn. To ensure that Latino students get equal opportunities to learn and advance, there needs to be change in the system. One method would be tapping into existing social and cultural resources in schools, households, and communities." Ferguson states, "Concerted efforts combined with the disposition to challenge the constraining ideologies and practices that characterize the educational status quo for Latino children are the minimal requirements to produce such change."
One thing we know is that education has never been free, it's never been equal, and it's never been this great equalizer that people claim it to be. Whether or not that's solely a race issue, or you think it's a class issue, or you think it's a combination of the two, it doesn't really matter. We do know that prejudice does exist and inequality does exist in our education fields. A big reason for that is that when you bring up sound judgment and reason against the absurdities brought on upon minorities of every minority group, really, the responses of the people in charge, the people who are supposedly educated, the people who are supposedly smart and able to run things smoothly, become very childish. They stop reasoning like an adult and they start reasoning like a child. We all work with children at some point, and it kind of reminds me of, like, I had this kid who would take off his shoes in class, and then I would say, "Hey, put your shoes back on." So he'd put his shoes back on, and then he'd take off his shirt and say, "Well, you never said I couldn't have my shirt off." And it's like, well, no, duh, you can't have your shirt off. Like, why would I want your shirt off to begin with? And the responses to stolen education are very similar. They claim, hey, everyone should get this equal opportunity at education, equal funding in education. And they say, well, if we do that, then everyone's going to become retarded. And, if we do that, then, we're ruining the education of the white people. And, it's because they speak Spanish, and because they speak Spanish, they can't be educated. And just the entire absurdity of everything, the excuses, the reasonings, the absolute lack of, caring, empathy, of being human is just beyond ridiculous, and it's something I really took away from the movie.